Hello and welcome to today's video from Carolina's Cottage. This is Johnny and I have several things to show you today that I created from thrifted items. I will show you a new technique I had not used before, and I'll also show you an old school way to paint with a cottage look from back in the day. This first piece has great potential. The lid on this piece has a lot of detail that fits cottage style or French country. But I do need to update this with a neutral color. I'm going to use chalk paint, air dry clay, and a stamp to update this piece. I'm preparing this for a piece of air dry clay, and because of the ridges on this, I'm just using some of the air dry clay to make a level area so I can glue the air dry clay embossed stamp on this, and you'll see what I mean as I work here. I need to create a foundation that will keep this piece flat while it dries. I'm rolling out a piece of air dry clay to the size and shape that I want the stamp to be. Next, I'll use a stamp and press it into the clay. Before I use the stamp, I do want to give it a generous dusting of cornstarch so the design doesn't stick in the clay. I will have the name of this stamp listed in the description below. I'm using an old butter knife that has a smooth edge to trim around the stamp. Next, I'm using wood glue to attach this to the jar, and I will let this sit overnight. When you are gluing a piece of air dry clay to a piece, you do want to make sure that all the edges are attached because this will shrink a little as it dries, and it's also a good idea to put a coat of chalk paint over the piece while it's still moist so that it doesn't shrink so much. Since this jar is such a slick surface, I'm going to use Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer. This will help with coverage, and it will help the chalk paint adhere to the slick glass surface. I let this primer dry overnight, and then I gave this 2 coats of Paint Couture Chalk Paint. The color I used on this one was Farmhouse Linen. I used an antiquing glaze by Paint Couture in the color Weathered Wood just to help the details show up. And I will link some information about Paint Couture in the description below. You can get 10% off on these products if you use my affiliate link, so I want to make sure I include that below. This next item is another thrifted one, and it has great potential. This had a heavy glaze on it, so I also used the 2-in-1 primer before I applied 2 coats of chalk paint to this one. The primer has a bit of a translucent look about it, but it really does help chalk paint stick to the piece. If you are enjoying this video so far, please give me a thumbs up for this. Please subscribe if you haven't already. If you're new here, please let me know. And if you're returning, thank you so much for watching. Now back to the video. I am using a portion of some of the Iron Orchid Designs crockery stamps that I have trimmed for small areas. This one is just some French lettering that I'm applying to the lid of this ginger jar. That's part of the beauty of these silicone stamps. They're very flexible and you can trim them to use just the pieces you want. For this jar, I'm inking up only the tips of these rosebuds to stamp on these small areas. The stamp I'm using is some of the roses from the Veranda Stamp Set from IOD. On the next piece, I'm going to pull out some old tricks from back in the day. I really did like the gold on the bottom of this piece. I painted over the black with a light pink color from Paint Couture called French Rose. So I thought back to the days when painting with acrylics was all the rave, and there were a few artists who had one-stroke teaching in books. This was back before internet. And I'm going to show you a few techniques from those styles that I used to update this piece. I used a few acrylic colors that I had on hand to create some small rosebuds and leaves, and the process is really pretty simple. As you can see, I'm no artist, and you really don't need to be an artist to use this technique. What you're doing is just using a lighter color with a darker color on your brush. You do minimal blending on the brush, and you do use water to keep the paint thin. I started by painting a pink teardrop shaped rosebud. I'll go back and add a darker pink and white blend on just one side of this. And then the second step for this rosebud will be to use the darker pink with a bit of yellow to add highlighting on the other side. I will do exactly the same thing to create the leaves, except I'll be using green with highlights of yellow or white. It's so simple. Just make sure you have plenty of paint on your brush and you're using a small brush. To make the vines and stems, I used a darker green and a lot of water to really thin this out so the brush would move easily. At the base of the rosebud, I made a small dot with the green paint on each one and then formed the stem. The next step is to connect each of the leaves to the stems by using a small curved stroke. The next part is a little more tricky. You have to really use thinned paint and a very small brush. I'm touching up some of the rosebuds with the medium shade of pink. The final step on this piece will be to paint the edges with Paint Couture's pale gold metallic paint. That will help it match the base. Then I will use a matte top coat from Paint Couture to protect this piece. And you could also use the weathered wood antiquing glaze, but I decided not to use that on this piece. This pale gold paint typically covers in one coat. You probably hear my kitty in the background. I don't know what he's telling me to do. Here's the result. It's a simple process and just a few steps to get this result. This next piece was in good condition. It has a nice cherry wood finish on it, but it doesn't match anything in my decor, and I don't think it would sell in my space. So I'm going to give it a couple of coats of chalk paint, and I'm using the color Buttercream from Paint Couture. I let this chalk paint dry overnight. I had put 2 coats on it. And then I put a top coat on it that has a matte finish. After that dried, I used Iron Orchid Designs ink and stamps, plus this one single rose is an Amazon stamp. The text that I'm adding here is one of the Iron Orchid Designs crockery stamps, and I just cut out the middle text to use in the small area. This is another stamp from the crockery set, and it's a perfect size for this space. The next thing I'll do is put pale gold trim on this piece, and I'm also going to add a bit of a cottage look to this by trimming it with French rose chalk paint from Paint Couture. Although it's a gorgeous, sweet color in person, this paint color is not showing up very well in this lighting, but I'll have a few pictures a little bit later that will give you a better idea of what a nice soft pink this is. I'm going to use 2 coats of this French rose paint. Then I'll be adding some weathered wood antiquing glaze. This glaze has a longer drying time than chalk paint or top coat, so it's really easy to paint the area and then go back and wipe off what you want. And if you want to add more to give it a more distressed look, the gel consistency gives you the time to do that. On this next piece, I'm going to use a technique I've not tried before. I'll be using Paint Couture's Textured Crust. And what I'm doing here is placing a little bit of it on this dark painted piece. I think as we walk through these steps, you'll understand what the goal of this technique is. So once I've decided how many little spots I'm going to cover with this crust, I'll put a coat of neutral colored chalk paint on this. The color I'm using here is Cozy Beige from Paint Couture. I'm painting over the textured crust that I had applied previously. You'll need to let the crust dry overnight before painting on it. Next, I'm going to apply another few spots of this textured crust, but I'm putting it in spaces other than where I had placed it before. I will let it dry and then I will paint over it with my final colors for this piece. And that's going to be a light pink, which is the French rose, on the outside border. And then on the inside, I'm going to use a very neutral Farmhouse Linen, kind of an ivory color. The textured crust that I've applied on this piece has dried and it's gotten pretty crusty. It's almost like a plaster. And once the chalk paint dries, I'm going to come back with a scraper and remove the textured crust. And what this will do is leave the paint colors beneath it that will help it look very aged and very distressed. And it's probably similar to what you could obtain by using wax between coats of paint, but this is just a technique that I had been wanting to try. I started out using a scraper, but then I switched to a softer wood stick, one of the ones that I use for transfer papers. I'm using this to remove the textured crust, and it's leaving the paint color that was underneath the crust. So it left black beneath the first layer of crust that I had applied, and it left some of the cozy beige color underneath where I had placed the crust on that layer of paint. After that, I used a fine grit sandpaper to smooth the area, and now I'm applying an Iron Orchid Design Stamp Set from the set Veranda. I'm not using the outer border on this. I did remove the stamp, but what you see here is just the backing remaining. So I'll be stamping with the roses that are in the center and then the small border around that. If you miss a spot when you're stamping, it's okay to go back and re-stamp that area. Just make sure to line it up very carefully so you don't get shadowing. I finished this piece up with a couple of rosebuds that I stamped from the edge of a bigger stamp on that IOD Veranda Stamp Set. And then I'm using a silky ribbon that I got from Amazon, and that will complete this cottage look. You can see here in these close-up shots of this piece how distressed this textured crust makes this piece look. This piece needed a little bit of work. It's a bamboo cutting board, and I didn't notice until I got it home that part of the feet section was missing. So I'm crafting a little extension out of air dry clay. I'm going to measure this and cut it in a shape to match the other side, and then I'll use wood glue to attach this. I will complete the look by using air dry clay in Iron Orchid Designs molds. I think this one is called Floral Swag, and I will put it in the description below. Most of these castings need to be trimmed and curved to fit this piece, but that's the beauty of using air dry clay. There's a lot of flexibility with the clay and with the mold. Dusting the mold with cornstarch helps the clay release, and I prefer to use a wood glue to attach these pieces. I apply chalk paint while the clay is still moist and apply a second coat to the entire piece. I'm using a section of the Veranda Stamp Set, and I'm adding to it by stamping just the rosebuds on the edges. I will highlight the detail on this piece by using weathered wood antiquing glaze on the edges, making sure to get the glaze into all the little creases, and then I'll come back with a paper towel or rag and wipe off the excess. What a very different look from just a plain bamboo cutting board. So let's do the before and after. Here's how these pieces looked before we did anything to them. Now we have repurposed and recycled decor that can be used in almost any setting. These could be used in a cottage style decor or a French country decor, and you could probably get away with sneaking them into a little bit of farmhouse decor as well. Let's review how we created these pieces. I used a few different supplies that I will list below in the description, and please remember that you can get a 10% off discount by using the affiliate link that I include below. I also used a little bit of old school technique to do some of the acrylic style painting from back in the day. We used stamps and air dry clay and a little bit of texture crust to create some unique distressing, and we did this fairly inexpensively. So if you like what you saw in today's video, please give it a thumbs up. Please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. Thank you for watching today, and I will see you in the next video.